Hi, welcome back to another edition of Political Theory Fun Time with me, Professor Selby. This is our third and final lecture on John Locke. And what we're going to do in this lecture is we're going to try to use his way of thinking and apply it to a series of ethical issues, okay? So I'm only going to do a couple, and then in class we're going to spend more time, and on your own you should be thinking about how does Locke apply in these various cases, okay? So keep that in mind. But one of the things I want you to really stay focused on as we're going through this exercise is the notion, the primary Lockean or liberal notion of a being endowed with reason, okay? So remember, everything with Locke comes back to reason in some sense. If you want to take a minute and Google Al Gore's Lock Box, to debates 2000, Al Gore Lock Box. It's got to be on YouTube. So all the humor I got, but you'll see why it's relevant in a minute. So take a second and go do that. Just hit pause if you like. Okay, so I'm going to keep going. So again, remember, let's just move my face over this way now. The primary Lockean assumption or liberal assumption is a being endowed with reason. And then that creates all kinds of other commitments that follow along behind it. This is one reason why government needs to be limited. People know what fundamentally, most of the time, people know what's best for them. So freedom of speech. Most of the time, people know what's best for them. So all kinds of other limited government types of ideas come along after that. Okay. Okay. So, I'm going to have to open you up here. There we go. Okay. The Locke Box is an ethical decision-making box machine designed by me, Dr. Selby. Okay. Now, this is pretty much sort of how you can use Locke to think through almost any issue. And you have a question that goes in down here on the left. Your question: can I, should I, may I, do we, can we, should we? Okay. And it goes into the machine there. And then the first thing you need to ask yourself is, how does natural law apply to this question? Can I murder somebody in cold blood? Natural law? No. You're not allowed to murder somebody in cold blood, right? Can I defend myself if someone's trying to attack me? Natural law? Yes, you're actually, I believe, obligated, according to how Locke puts together natural law, to defend yourself. So, there you go. When you get to natural law, there's three possible answers. There's one: whatever we're doing here is ethically or morally obligatory. It's no questions about it. You have to do it, okay? Second, you can't do it. It's impermissible. You are not allowed to kill in cold blood, but you probably do have to defend yourself, right? And then the third one is permissible if you choose, okay? So, well, natural law is basically silent. It's not saying we can or can't do this. What that means is we'll go to the next question. Consent. Did you consent, right? Did you vote? Right? Or is there at least voting available to you? I mean, that would count for Locke as well. Like, well, I didn't vote. It's like, well, but is this North Korea or is this America? In America, you get to vote. If you choose not to vote, you're saying whatever other people decide is fine. So you did consent. You said whatever other people decide is fine. In North Korea, you don't vote because you're not allowed to vote. I mean, technically, the North Korean, I think they're called People's Party, whatever they are. They might have some votes, but everything is 100% to zero, because if you vote the wrong way, they just kill you. So I don't think that counts, right? That doesn't count as consent. And then if you consented, great. If you didn't, then it's not allowed, okay? So it's a pretty sort of like straightforward decision-making scheme, if you will. And I call it the Locke Box. And, this is the brilliance of Professor Selby. Normally I do these hand drawings on the board. You get them, here. So let's take a few examples, right? Okay. So let's take education. Let's go back. Do we have an obligation to provide free K to 12 education for all citizens or all people, right? Do we have an obligation to provide it? Well, what's natural law going to say? Well, you know, self-preservation, preserve mankind. You're kind of like, I don't know. But remember this first criteria of a being endowed with reason. Okay, so if we do not provide free and universal public education, are people going to be rational individuals the way liberals want them to be? And the answer is probably not. Okay, some of them, yes, but we're going to have so much more lacking here that it's such a high ethical priority, right? Now, it doesn't mean you get free college. Lots of industrialized democracies only provide free education to say about like 16. So whether it's 16, 17, 18, 19, I mean, where you draw that line is much different from like, look, there's a very high ethical priority put upon education. And to say, oh, well, they chose not to get educated is BS, because you need to be educated before you can properly choose, at least according to the liberal logic, right? It doesn't have to be crazy high level education, but like reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? Like we can't really expect people to be liberal individuals if they can't read, write, and do arithmetic. Some people will get there still, sure. Some people, magically teach themselves to write. I mean, let's not argue from the exception here. We're talking about the general tendency. And the general tendency is if you want liberal people, you got to have free public education. Okay, let's take a look at another one. So this is a big debate. So these are just some of the ones that, I just like put up here for fun. But medically accurate sexual education. Well, what about that, right? And this is a big debate people have. Well, from a liberal point of view, medically accurate sexual education is quite important. You cannot expect people to make adult informed choices about their sexual health and preferences and desires without knowing how things work, how to prevent unintended pregnancy, all of those kinds of things. So, it's the old saying, bad stuff in, bad stuff out, right? If you just if you prevent individuals from having access to accurate medical or scientific information, don't be surprised when they make decisions that that reflect the fact that they don't have that information, right? So from a liberal point of view, right, it's like, well, these are people who maybe they're not at the age of maturity yet, but they are going to be there. They're starting to engage in sexual activity. So providing medically accurate sexual education is very important to liberals. You cannot lie or play fast with lying in general is really like liberals are like, nope, like some liberals kind of go batty on here. Never lie. It's completely wrong all the time, et cetera, et cetera. But the reason is because the use of reason necessitates the most accurate information possible. Okay. So there you go. Very interesting. Well, what about self-defense? Okay. Remember here, okay, I'm going to take a couple examples. The liberal logic, you delegate the natural law or the enforcement of rights to the government. And if the government can't enforce it, it comes back to you. That could be, the government is taken over by a foreign power. It can't do anything anymore. Or it could be you're in your home at night. Someone breaks in, they're a bad guy. There's no cop right there. In that moment, the government is unable to enforce your right to self-preservation. So you get to enforce it yourself. Okay. Now, the truth be told, home invasions are incredibly rare. The type of thing that people get so upset about and, it scares them. They really get scared by it. I mean, of course it happens. Everything happens, but it's quite rare. And then, and here's an interesting one. So on education, the liberal thing goes like pretty clearly, you got to do education. On self-defense, the question here becomes, well, of course you're allowed to defend yourself, but does that mean you have a right, say, to keep firearms in the house? Well, that's an interesting, different point, isn't it? If we were in a situation, which some countries are, I mean, just empirically, I just can't lie to you about this, where guns basically do not exist in society at all, and no, your average criminal does not have guns, right? Some very fancy drug gangs might, but it's really that hard to get guns. Average criminals don't have them. And the only reason why a drug gang would break into your house is because you are somehow affiliated with them. So now we're really changing the story here, aren't we, right? But, imagine a situation where your average criminal does not have a gun. That means you don't need a gun either. And your right to self-preservation is just as active in that scenario as it is in a scenario where, say, everybody has guns. So you might think, oh, liberalism, automatically leads to some kind of like right to bear arms and keep firearms in the home. It certainly doesn't. It can go either way. And then you want to start asking questions about, well, do permissive firearm regulations lead to sort of like overall negative consequences, suicides, homicides, etc.? The answer is yes. I mean, the research is out there. There's higher levels of social violence more generally when you have permissive gun regulations. Okay. And so, just keep that in mind, right? But just also think back to our state of nature. Like this one should have been relatively obvious to you from our first lecture on the state of nature, right? If someone comes and says, give me your stuff or else are you allowed to defend yourself? The answer is, of course you are. But the whole point of going into a state of government is that you don't have to keep a gun with you all the time, right? Think the Wild West. There was maybe some government, but boy, it was not very good. What did you have to do? Go out into the street and shoot around with some boys for a while. Nobody wants that. That's bad, right? Bad. I don't know. It came out kind of sheepy there. That's bad. Some Shaun the Sheep. And then, another case, there's a famous ethical dilemma, the Good Samaritan. If you're on your way to a job interview and someone's drowning, are you obligated to stop and save them? And I think the way Locke is thinking is that the answer is yes. It's not threatening your life. Maybe you're not going to get that job interview, but you know what? If you show up and you say, I'm sorry I was late, I was saving somebody's life, and they'll say, really? And you'll say, yeah, I brought the guy with me. He's right here. I said, the only thing I'm going to be late to a job interview. I saved your life. Will you come validate that story for me? And, any employer who doesn't like that is crazy, right? They'd be like, oh, well, this is a great guy. We should hire him. He's incredibly ethical. He, unless you're going to go work for the mob or something. But, he saved a guy's life and then he was late. He said he was honest. He was late. He was sorry. He brought the guy. I mean, come on. And that's the second law of nature, right? Which is, the second law of nature is preserve mankind, right? So the main exception to, well, you don't have to be, Mother Teresa and completely altruistic. But the preserve mankind thing, it seems secondary, which it kind of is, but it is actually quite important. And it's like, oh, well, my self-preservation means I need to get the job. Well, but it doesn't really. I mean, you have to hypothesize too many different things of, if I don't get this job, I'm literally going to starve, et cetera, et cetera. And it just doesn't seem to be the case. Now, if saving the man meant you would die for whatever reason, then, you're on your way to a kidney dialysis appointment. And if you don't get there on time, then you're not going to get it. And then you're going to die. Well, that's different because self-preservation is the number one law of nature. Okay. But there has to be a pretty direct link between, those two things. Now, what I want you to do now is your notes from this video must include a drawing of the Locke box and 3 attempts at answering ethical questions. You'll write 5 sentences or so on each of those ethical questions you would like to put through the lockbox. We'll do a bunch of these together. Pick anything, okay? Doesn't have to be controversial. Obviously the controversial ones are a little more exciting or whatever, but you know, do we have to pave potholes? Should we have roads? You know, pretty much anything is okay. Drugs, interesting question. Drugs are a really interesting question from a Lockean point of view. But then think about the different types of drugs that are out there. There's, you know, alcohol, cigarettes, tobacco. Those are the legal ones. Marijuana is sort of semi-legal now. But you know, what about harder drugs, psychedelics? There's a fly flying around. You know, do all of them, do some of them, do all of them, do none of them pass through the sort of Lockean lockbox sort of way of thinking? Okay, so just pause your video because I can't just wait here. I gotta like keep going and think about that. Oh, and that's the end of the slideshow. So here's your lockbox. I want you to think very carefully about this. Okay, this is incredibly important. There it is.